What is up, everybody? This is Jay, aka MultimediaJay, in probably one of the most bare bones chat streams that I've done in a while here. Chat is turned off, alerts are turned off. I'm not here to have any kind of conversations with anybody or entertain any kind of conversations. I'm here to just say my piece and end stream. Still got some game streaming I would like to do, but before we do anything, I would like to talk about this whole situation with Final Fantasy XIV. I first started playing Final Fantasy XIV, and it's a sort of game I've played on and off over the years. Do I still have it in the stack? No, I put it back. I first started playing Final Fantasy XIV in version 1.0 when it came out, and I actually built Tuxedo in 2010 in order to be able to handle Final Fantasy XIV, because I thought my Core 2 Duo system couldn't handle it. Turned out the game was very poorly made, and it was not efficient at all. So Final Fantasy XIV, I go back to the beginning of that game. But after seeing Zepla's video on how easy it is to get banned from Final Fantasy XIV under the new harassment policy expansion that they've recently done, I've decided to end all involvement with that game, and I encourage others to do likewise. I think that what's going on with Final Fantasy XIV is mirroring and basically history repeating itself in terms of what happened to World of Warcraft that eventually led to its downfall as an MMO. So I've been referencing Total Biscuit in 2011 when he decided to quit WoW during the Cataclysm era. Total Biscuit mentioned a couple of things that were the reason why he decided to quit playing WoW, but one of them kind of stuck with me since then. But here's the thing. For those of you that weren't around when Total Biscuit was quitting WoW back in 2011, Total Biscuit quitting WoW was a huge thing. Before he lost his fight with cancer and whatnot, and before he became the big gaming celebrity and whatnot and stuff like that, Total Biscuit was a WoW guy. He was totally a WoW commentator. He was the head honcho of WoW Radio, an unofficial radio station that was related to World of Warcraft and stuff like that. There were all kinds of other stuff. There was all kinds of other stuff going on too back then. He was involved in some shows and some other things. But so Total Biscuit, before he became the big gaming commentator that he was a big WoW commentator. And so him quitting World of Warcraft to move in a different direction at all was big news back then. Among the things he talked about back then, and I actually linked the video in a community post as well as on Twitter, but he talked about things like content nerfs and the pattern that Blizzard had settled into by early Cataclysm, where only the current content matters. All the previous stuff would routinely be rendered obsolete by whatever the current stuff was, such that there really was no progression in WoW anymore. You basically were only doing the current set of raids or whatever, because there was so much catch-up gear that nothing else really mattered. So there were ways essentially, so WoW became basically a disjointed game of raiders clearing content, and there wasn't something like in Burning Crusade where you would form a raid team, you'd work on heroics, then you get attuned, you do Karazhan, then you do Gruul's Lair, SSC, etc., and make progress that way. The progression elements of WoW, in terms of playing catch-up and it not being a bad thing if you were behind, ended with the Crusaders Colosseum patch in late Lich King. So Ulduar was basically the last patch where World of Warcraft was under the philosophy, so to speak, the development philosophy that defined its growth years. Soon afterwards, World of Warcraft would start losing subscribers and sink down from its peak to what it is today. One of the things that Total Biscuit mentioned back then was this idea of the WoW devs not having a game where gamers need to improve as gamers in order to progress. That it was the sort of game where you essentially could whine and complain on the forums and whatnot, just not get better at the game, and eventually the content would get nerfed, and the challenge that you previously had to learn how to overcome would just vanish all on its own. You could play the attrition game and eventually get to see the content on some low difficulty level after several nerfs. What this speaks to is a fundamental issue with how human beings treat each other. If you have a situation where somebody needs to step up to the plate, they need to step up to the plate and get better. There is no sugarcoating it. And there certainly is no lying to the person in order to keep them happy. Side note, lying to someone to keep them happy often doesn't work because they find out you are lying to them and they're even more upset with you as a result. So, Total Biscuit back in 2011 saw that Cataclysm had gone in the direction where instead of people having to get better at the game, World of Warcraft was caving to people whining and crying and lowering the difficulty, and basically, challenges would only be challenging for so long, and the numbers reflected this change in attitude as things declined for a decade afterwards. So, where do I see that with Final Fantasy, especially considering Final Fantasy XIV's current success, big streamers playing the game, and all kinds of other stuff? Where I see that in is in the expansion of their harassment policies. It may not be dev design that's the culprit this time, but is this walking on eggshells culture where you can get banned for things like telling someone they need to improve if your tone is off? This kind of stuff, I think, is going to stagnate the game and eventually make it worse. So when it comes to Final Fantasy, an important thing to remember with the Final Fantasy fad of 2021 is that a lot of people are falling squarely into the camp of liking Final Fantasy because they hate World of Warcraft. It's a behavior that I've seen largely in sports from people that are poor sports. Take, for example, I'm from the Northeast, the rivalry between the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. I've seen numerous years where the Red Sox didn't do as well as the Yankees. The Red Sox would get eliminated while the Yankees went to the playoffs, and Red Sox fans would suddenly be cheering on every team that played against the Yankees because the Red Sox had gotten eliminated. They couldn't be proper sports about it and admit that their team hadn't played well enough and therefore lost, essentially, by getting eliminated in the playoffs or not even making the playoffs. So they decided to be poor sports about the matter and just, and heckle and whatnot and cheer for teams that were playing the Yankees. And the fan bases of those teams were often upset with that sort of thing, unless they hated the Yankees themselves. But there were people, and I've seen people arguing on the internet about this. One of many, many things I've seen people argue on the internet about over the years. I've seen people on the internet arguing about this, like, stick with your team. Don't just pretend to be a fan of our team just because we're playing the Yankees. So there's an element of that in play with Final Fantasy XIV, people loving FF14, and they're determined to see no wrong with that game simply because they hate WoW. They don't like the way the game has been. They don't like the scandals at Blizzard, etc. So they are absolutely determined to see no evil, so to speak, in their adopted game of Final Fantasy XIV. I can tell you that even before this fad became a thing this year, Final Fantasy was already a game where I could count on Final Fantasy players causing tons of drama. Some of the worst online multiplayer that I've dealt with in MMOs in recent years has not been in World of Warcraft. It has been in Final Fantasy XIV. In the worst case, there was someone who joined my free company who basically needed professional help. But instead of seeking help from people who are actually qualified to give them the help they needed, they instead went sad fishing on essentially their guild mates, since Final Fantasy tries to be clever by coming up with all these fancy new words for stuff that already exists in other games. So this person was coming on to Final Fantasy and Discord and whatnot, and sad fishing for sympathy from guild mates, essentially. From people recreationally playing a video game. From people who are ill qualified to help her with their problems, or even, know what the problems were. You don't know when people decide to, act a certain way on the internet, whether they're serious or not. Now you need some evidence to corroborate that. Otherwise, it's pretty much worse than rumors at this point. So I've already associated Final Fantasy with drama, and then there was the drama on Twitter, of course. Asmongold starts playing Final Fantasy, and now here comes some Final Fantasy players brigading to have him banned because they don't like him. But that's far from the only drama I've ever seen from Final Fantasy players. So as you can imagine, the combination of toxicity in the game already, and now a bunch of people coming over from World of Warcraft and bringing WoW's toxicity to Final Fantasy because they are determined to see absolutely nothing wrong with Final Fantasy, despite its limitations, its dated design, its second-gen MMO features, and other things that Elder Scrolls Online and Guild Wars 2, quite frankly, are better at. Final Fantasy, obviously, as you can imagine, has been having more and more people problems, and this led to some of these policy enhancements. Here's the thing with the expanded harassment policy in Final Fantasy XIV. I agree with 95% of it. There are some behaviors that the Final Fantasy folks are calling out and making actionable items that I think the World of Warcraft folks should have made actionable items and done more to prevent in WoW over the years that I was involved with that game. There's plenty going on. There's plenty of stuff in this policy that I actually agree with. So I agree with 95% of it. The remaining 5% of it, though, is so off base that it is so off base and so wrong that I think this is basically the peak of Final Fantasy. And I think that beginning with the actions and behaviors of the player base, we're going to start seeing Final Fantasy XIV start to go down the same path as WoW. Let me get lit up really good here as I put their website on the screen in front of me and go over some of the stuff. Well, maybe not a full-size window or maybe even a half-size window. Just read it like we're reading a newspaper and get lit up big time. Let's take a look at some of this stuff here, some of the stuff I've opened up, some of the things I have a serious problem with. Most of what it is under nuisance behavior. So it hurts others or obstructs their gameplay, but which is not qualified as, not classed as harassment. The big one under offensive expression. Expression in general that inflicts emotional distress by being offensive to another person. Now, it's one thing if you're insulting people or you're throwing around personal insults or being a bad sport in PvP or something like that. It's something completely different in a PvE environment when they're causing problems in like a group or something and you call them out and then they turn around and throw the harassment policy at you. So here's some bullet points that I've opened up off of their document that are serious problems waiting to happen. Using insulting words such as stupid, idiot, die, crazy, garbage, or trash to offend others. Blaming and attacking others, like saying it's someone's fault that we wiped or you make a lot of mistakes or whatever, is prohibited. If a report gets filed, prohibited activity is confirmed, a penalty will be issued. Now, of these loaded terms here, die is probably the only one I have any problem with. The rest of them, however, could just be, judgments of like morals or something. It could just be their subjective statements that could refer to something that people are doing, or there's something that might actually be causing progression problems in a group, or a huge repair bill, or the inability to clear a dungeon. If somebody does something that's stupid, they've done something that's stupid. You can't lie to somebody. Like if someone's standing in the fire, you can't lie to somebody in order to keep them happy. If somebody's standing in the fire or something like that, or doing something that is stupid, it needs to be called out as such. If someone is persistently acting like an idiot, then idiot is a descriptive term more so than an insult. Same thing if people are doing stuff that's crazy, or something's garbage or trash, or a strategy is garbage or trash. Those are all ways in which people disagree with each other. And yeah, criticism hurts, but if you are holding back other people's progression, you are the problem and you need to do something about it. And other people need to be able to say what you're doing is hurting the team. Some of the encouragement of walking on eggshells with this new Final Fantasy stuff would not fly in things like, say, corporate America or any business environment where you have to sit down with a poor performer, for example, and tell them that they're performing poorly. When the ability to be competitive as a team is on the line because of the bad apples on your team, you need to deal with the bad apples. And that's going to lead to, at minimum, awkward conversations, if not conversations that might hurt someone's feelings because they don't like what you're telling them, even if it's true. So if somebody is not doing enough DPS and the group is wiping because it's hitting the enrage timer on a raid boss or something, then yes, somebody's subpar for performance is precisely the reason why the group's progression is being held back. Now, a lot of times people like me who want to go in and do well and follow mechanics and learn fights and stuff, we get called elitist jerks. But you got to ask yourself, who's being disrespectful when you can't be bothered to learn how to play the game that you're playing with others? Who's being disrespectful? Especially when you consider putting yourself in the shoes of the people you're playing this game with. So, here's the thing. Video games are often recreational for people not getting involved in esports and stuff. You're talking about things people are doing for fun in their spare time. They're coming home from like school or work or something, and they got problems. They want to get away from their problems for a bit. They want to play a game. They don't need new problems introduced by people who can't be bothered to learn how to play the game. People that, for example, my pet peeve right now in ESO is people that can't be bothered to actually gear up as a tank before they tank a random dungeon group. You see a tank show up in light armor with 18,000 health, and they get insta-gibbed by the bosses in the dungeon, and then some of them might even be dumb enough to blame the healer when they can't be bothered to actually get some tank gear. It's not like tank gear completely eliminates your ability to do damage either. Even World of Warcraft got away from that, where protection warriors couldn't really solo or whatever, unless they pulled a bunch of mobs and whittled them all down one by one. Protection paladins did that too for a while too, but game design has moved away from that. It's not the worst thing in the world if you show up to a dungeon group or a raid or whatever with gear that is appropriate to what it is that you want to do. It's not the biggest demand in the world to ask people if they're tanking, show up in tank gear. If they're healing, show up in healing gear, etc. Now, personal tastes and personal insults I can understand. You shouldn't be pestering people like that. And even if you want to try and call it constructive criticism, it's not really useful feedback at all when you just say something's bad and you won't explain why it's bad. Same thing, too, with stuff that's unrelated, like, no wonder you can't do this, look at how you dress your character. That's unrelated and irrelevant. So, this is just a matter of learning to deal with difficult people. But instead, you have a situation where somebody can file a harassment report and get someone banned from the game. So, the thing is, life doesn't work that way. You need to be able to handle difficult people, and you need to understand that people are going to disagree with you. Literally just by the mathematics involved, by the law of probability and the like. Literally, you basically can expect people will dislike you no matter how likable you try to be, just by law of averages. Just by being yourself. Just by being yourself, you can expect to make enemies at the same time that you're making friends. Simple as that. So, you have to be able to deal with this stuff. It's all part of maturing and whatnot. And I understand there's a lot of crap in Final Fantasy because the drama's been snowballing over there. But you can't go so far as to eliminate the ability for people to have difficult conversations with somebody who is, say, holding back a guild's progression, and a 10-man, 25-man, whatever raid team now is getting their ability to have fun ruined because someone else won't step up to the plate. So, and then there's the threats thing. And if you get on my bad side, you'll be kicked from the group, da-da-da. That's understandable. But it's important to remember that one of the reasons why Final Fantasy has the problems that it has is because it's still overly reliant on servers. If a toxic raiding guild, for example, or a toxic raiding static or whatnot can monopolize progression on a server and basically be a big fish in a small pond, you're going to see the entire server devolve into drama because of that. That was my early experience in World of Warcraft playing on Alex Straza US, where the server progression was horrible because the progression guilds were not very good, but at the same time were extremely toxic. And other servers like Storm Rage were known for having more progression and more level-headed leadership in raiding guilds. So some of this is something Square Enix needs to solve by catching up to the wonderful world of something besides servers for your video game infrastructure. So it's all a matter of the environment that these players are playing in. Let's see. Sarcastic responses, da-da-da. People like you will never get better. Our statements like that are prohibited. The thing is, you need to actually be able to say why someone's never going to get better. Like if someone won't gear up, someone won't learn a rotation, someone won't learn the fight, You need to be able to tell that to people. Otherwise, what we have is an environment where everybody walks on eggshells and progression is held back and people's enjoyment of the game is held back because of the very kind of socialization that MMOs are supposed to specialize in. So, okay, you can team up with like 10 people and take down a raid boss, or 25 people or whatever. And no, but it's just, you know, you have to walk on eggshells. How is that fun? So let's see. You can't tell somebody that they're not following a popular strategy. You cannot demand somebody change the way they play. I'm sure guild leaders will have a lot of fun with that, aka free company leaders. I'm sure that people leading raid teams will have a lot of fun with not being able to tell people that the way that they are playing and basically holding back the team's progression is not good enough. It's prohibited to mock another player for making mistakes, even though learning via embarrassment is one way that people learn. Let's see here. Can't set off fireworks if someone stands in the fire and they get KO'd in the middle of a raid fight or something like that, etc. This also applies to stuff on stream as well. So a streamer can be banned for saying something about a rando in a pickup group if someone reports them. So you can't excessively criticize or condemn others. I mean, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, you got to give people a chance to get better. You can't just tell them they're bad, because they pretty much never will. And they'll never get better if you keep just hawking on them. And it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you'll just basically manufacture stuff to be miserable about. It's one of the shortcomings of leadership, things like that. So let's see. By and large, though, the big issue here is you can't tell people the hard truth about something. You essentially have to lie in order to not get banned. There's another major part here. Let's see. There's another major problem that this creates, and that is sandbagging. Now, I know some of you folks maybe who play first-person shooters or other competitive games, maybe you're familiar with the concept of throwing, where one of your teammates is being toxic and they're just playing badly on purpose to make you lose, to make everyone else miserable. Sandbagging is similar. It's when you're definitely, you are explicitly not playing good on playing well enough on purpose. You're doing a lot worse than you usually do on purpose. It's basically a form of sabotaging the team. The problem is, remember that when you're dealing with difficult people, not everybody has to make sense. So what this invites, and this is one of the things I ran into with my rotten experience with the person who was sad fishing in the free company instead of doing something constructive to solve their problems. One of the things I ran into was you'd run a group with them, like for a dungeon or something. They play badly, and then people would start complaining. They'd play badly and whatnot, and you had to wonder, after they did that a whole bunch of times, were they malicious or incompetent? Were they really that terrible at the game, or were they doing that on purpose? Because if they sad fish for people to cry on their shoulder outside of a dungeon group, how do you think they're going to behave inside of a dungeon group? If they like getting people upset so they can fish for sympathy. So like play bad, get called out for it, say, I'm sorry, and it just keep never getting better. Well, those are the sad ones. Let's talk about the mad ones. With an environment like this, Final Fantasy is inviting toxic people to play the game badly, to get people upset with them and call them out on it, and then report them. So they can see them get suspended from the game or something and be like, So sometimes you got to watch so that, your policies for fixing toxicity like this don't backfire on you. But at the core of all of this is devs and, folks in charge caving to people that are toxic and crying and things like that. These people are caving to the bad apples by having policies like this. They're basically caving to people who are going to get caught up in this whole issue that the game's eventually going to have, where people are, they'll just like, oh, don't you tell me how to play. You don't pay my sub, and if you keep it up, I'm going to report you and get you suspended. Not good. It was interesting, World of Warcraft had this problem when World of Warcraft had this problem when they caved to people crying with content nerfs and making everything before the current content obsolete. Final Fantasy is caving to people crying by creating an environment where, oh, well, you can't tell someone the hard truth about something because the game devs and the game administrators don't want people's feelings to get hurt. This is not going to help anything. I mean, look, if Final Fantasy is supposed to be this game where everybody is all, friendly all the time, even in, say, big raid fights and stuff, then just dumb down the difficulty of the game and turn it into a social game. Turn it into a theme park where it just looks like Final Fantasy. People can casually play it, and there won't be too much of a challenge that'll get people even worked up enough to engage in that kind of behavior in the first place. But if that's not going to be the case, if there's going to be higher difficulty levels, if there's going to be like raids and statics and stuff, you have to understand that unless you custom build a team that you know is good, you're going to have to deal with anything from awkward to antagonistic encounters with people who don't want to support the team properly. There's a team element to things like downing bosses and not wiping in dungeons, or even just not being stressed in dungeons. One of the big things I ran into with Final Fantasy when I tried running dungeons there is this meta of we've cleared the dungeon a million times. Even if you're brand new to the dungeon, we still want to blow through it as fast as possible. So I ran into situations where it was basically Wrath of the Lich King all over again, despite Square Enix's attempts to nerf AoE damage. The way it worked was tank, pull everything as possible, everything in the room, pull as much stuff as possible, DPS AE as much as possible, healer spam as much as possible. So just spam, basically Wrath of the Lich King all over again. Well, if we're talking about Wrath of the Lich King, then these progressions into caving to this kind of toxic behavior and whatnot is cataclysm for this game. And so by continuing down this path, Final Fantasy now is in a situation where you can have constructive teams. Those will be the only teams clearing content, because you're going to have people that are ready to report someone if the team is anything but perfect going into a raid fight or whatever. So, a fight with one of the summoned monsters or anything of that sort. So, the bottom line here, and this is, 10 years later, me agreeing with Total Biscuit on this, is that game developers need to preserve the need for people to get better. That's what progression is. You get better in the game and you get better at playing it, you get rewarded for it. The minute that goes away and things aren't compelling anymore, that's when you can safely say that an MMO has peaked. Blizzard started caving to crybabies. The need to get better at the game went away and the decline began. On the Final Fantasy side of things, because you can't address someone without risking getting banned, because you can't have a difficult conversation with somebody without the risk of them reporting you and getting you banned, you can't have the kind of difficult conversations you need to have when somebody is really not pulling their weight in a dungeon or a raid group. You can't have that. And so the need to get better is going to get eroded, and all of the consequences with that will show up in Final Fantasy. It's really sad because, Final Fantasy is a game where it's a great theme park. There's a lot of elements of previous Final Fantasy games and stuff, and as a world, Eorzea is compelling to get into. But unless Square Enix decides to make socialization optional in Final Fantasy XIV, like take the trust system and apply it to all the dungeons so you never have to group with other players, there is always the risk that other players will not really be interested in knowing what the heck they're doing. And then what? If you say anything, you run the risk of getting banned. Now, what happens when people start doing that on purpose? What happens when toxic people... And that's the thing. Not all toxic people are angry and aggressive. Some toxic people are a little more subtle about how they make everyone around them worse. Not everybody who's toxic is angry and aggressive all the time like this policy makes it seem. There's more subtle toxicity, like crying for rules like this. So now you can't tell anybody anything about how they play the game unless you very carefully walk on eggshells and tippy-toe around something in order to tell people they need to get better at something. I don't see that working out. Now, you can say that they need to bring down the hammer on people being antagonistic and aggressive and ruining other people's fun. But at the same time, you got somebody that won't get with the program, that ruins the group's fun. And when people start figuring out they can't say stuff without risking getting banned, when people are just vote kicked with no explanation and they're getting kicked out of groups a lot, how's that going to be fun? Or how about a bunch of people playing Final Fantasy and they have a secret Discord or some kind of voice comms that are not publicly accessible, so they can say all they want and whatnot and kick people out and whatnot, kick people out of dungeon groups and blah, blah, blah. And they just keep it hidden so that nobody can report them because there's nothing to go off of. It's just this setup where you have to walk on eggshells and you can't tell someone the hard truth about something is not going to be good for the game any more than Blizzard caving to people crying about them trying to make Cataclysm difficult again because Lich King got too easy. Any more than that didn't work. Once you cave and you get away from this idea that people playing a video game have to get with the program and get better at the game in order to progress, the game is over. Your game has peaked, and we've already seen this with a decade of decline for World of Warcraft. I know it sounds ridiculous. I mean, Final Fantasy XIV is doing better than it ever has been. But it's hype. A lot of that hype is being buoyed by angry WoW players who are determined to see no wrong in Final Fantasy. I got dislikes when I brought this up last time. I'm sure I'll get dislikes again for bringing it up this time. But if you like a game by mere virtue of hating another game, that's not a clear-minded point of view on that game. So it's empty hype, and quite frankly, it's fanboyism. And it's important for any gamer out there to see past the fanboyism here. So bottom line, it was a mistake for the Final Fantasy leadership folks to overstep and cross the line on this boundary with regards to constructive criticism or any kind of criticism for this matter. If you're making people upset and they call you out on it, that you're ruining their fun, and you turn around and report them for harassment and get them banned, what do you think that's going to do to the group environment when more people start figuring this out? Or how about toxic people playing badly on purpose to get people yelling at them and get them banned because they really don't want to play the game. They just want to, get their kicks off of trolling people. So the Final Fantasy facade will shatter at some point. For now, I want nothing more to do with the game. I don't care how compelling it gets either. Both Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft have done something this year that has made me just want to play ESO more and more and more and more and more. And quite frankly, I would rather stick to the game that isn't like a pen of sorts for toxic, immature people who can't approach things maturely like adults. Whatever the popular game is with the pretty looking characters, whether it's cat girls or night elves, makes no difference. This has been a thing in MMOs for many, many years. The prettier characters and, stuff like folks dancing in Limsa Laminza and whatnot, it's going to eventually attract people who can't have mature conversations about things like not enough DPS in an instance or standing in the wrong place or not following the strategy or whatever. But this goes too far. And for a game to be successful and maintain the success, as we've seen from history and as we're going to see again, you need to never allow the need to get better at a game to overcome challenges to be eroded in favor of whining and crying until you get nerfs or some way to get out of having to get better as a player and as a person. If Shadowbringers wasn't it, I'll just make a wild prediction right now. Endwalker is the peak of Final Fantasy XIV. And afterwards, the bad fruit, so to speak, of the seeds that are planted or whatever, the rotten side effects of these moves that these folks have made, And remember, we're not talking, most of the stuff that's in the new harassment policy I agree with. The remaining stuff, though, is so egregiously bad that it made me want to have nothing to do with this game ever again. When the effects of that come into play, Final Fantasy XIV is the next WoW. And people are going to be like, how is this possible? It seemed so amazing during Shadowbringers. It seemed unstoppable during Shadowbringers and Endwalker, because sometimes with video games, success or failure, or whether a game grows or dies, comes down to dumb little details. And sometimes changing the wrong detail at the wrong time can pretty much set a game on a course to its eventual end. Star Wars Galaxy has a good example of that. Level 1 Jedi. So, that's all I have to say to that. Not much to this chat stream. Let's get to some game streams here. This is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.